So last time we discussed this first question up on the board here, which was we kind of spent a lot of time introducing GDP, talking about what we use it for, both as kind of policy makers and as individuals making decisions about investment and careers and so on. And then we talked, I guess, a bit about how that process of making use of this figure might be derailed if the figure itself becomes less meaningful and therefore a less valid basis for action and decision making. And the plan we discussed last time for today was to talk about the second question, maybe even the third. Can we see hints of this decoupling or loss of relevance of GDP out there in the world today? And we're sort of talking mostly about it as a consequence of technological disruption, although maybe there's broader things also. Before you came in, Adam, on this third board up here, I just put in, I don't know if it's the same in the US, but I looked at the Reserve Bank of Australia's webpage and they define GDP to be the average of three figures: the total GDP, which is total value produced, GDPI, total income, and GDPE, total expenditure, just added over all consumers and businesses and I guess the government as well.
So they're sort of, as I meant, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but that looks to me like, and I think I used the word triangulate last time, but basically taking several measures that are, at least in principle, they're measuring roughly the same thing, but it's hard to know where there's error, how much noise there is in the signal beach. It looks like they're just giving these equal weight in a simple, basically constructing a simple even weighting of these three. Is that fair?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't know what I think about that even, but it looks like something that's been done the same way for a very long time, possibly, like long enough that it's been done this way since before computers were widespread, for example.
Mm-hmm.
It has the feel of something from a very different era to me.
Yeah, you have to wonder whether the developers of EVE Online or large-scale online multiplayer games with their own economies, what they do, how they measure they must report to their shareholders something like GDP, I guess, but they have all the data. It'd be interesting to see how they would do it differently. But
that really is, yeah, that really would be.
I remember reading at some point that Valve hired, and actually it was Yanis Varoufakis. I'm pronouncing his name incorrectly, I'm sure, but do you know who I'm speaking about? He was the treasurer, I guess, in Greece during the showdown with Germany some years ago. When the left-wing government was there. Yeah, so he's a kind of a political power player globally, but he spent some time as the chief economist inside Valve Software, this company that made Half-Life and many other games and now runs Steam. So he was I believe that's correct. He was sort of playing that role that I just described of trying to run the internal economy of the gaming platforms, if I get that straight.
Fascinating.
Okay, I think you had some. Yeah, so what's your introduction to question 2 here? How would you put this in context?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question. Can we see any hints already that of what we would expect to see if GDP were ceasing to reflect the sorts of if it were ceasing to actually indicate the things that we're properly interested in, and in that sense, I think we're interested in GDP as a means of evaluating, fundamentally evaluating material prosperity. Let's say that, and there is an assumption both directions from material prosperity. The from material prosperity to sort of a deeper level, there's the assumption that material prosperity is a reasonable proxy for human well-being writ large. And I think that's quite fair across the great arc of human history, certainly, and even in the modern era. There are a lot of people who are still suffering terribly in the world, and material prosperity is a massive portion of what causes suffering in the real world still today. Well, yes, in some societies, the wealthiest and most socially progressive and successful societies, you could argue that we're sort of moving out of that era of materially determined suffering and into up a few levels in sort of Maslow's hierarchy, if you want to think in those terms, sort of deal. And that people still suffer, but they're not suffering because they don't have enough food to eat. They're suffering for social and psychological and existential reasons. Okay, so, but at any rate, material prosperity sort of points in one direction as a proxy to something that I guess we really, truly, deeply care about, which is human well-being. Okay. On the other hand, from the other direction, productivity, production, consumption, income, these things that are actually that one could hope reasonably to quantify, as in the formula for the GDP in Australia, those are themselves, those are a proxy or at least a close correlation, or somehow a reasonable reflection of material prosperity. So material prosperity is a proxy for human well-being, but material prosperity itself is something that we're determining by by measuring these other things. And we can't measure material prosperity directly, so we have to measure other things and infer from those other things, producing, consuming, people reporting income on their taxes, and these other imperfect things or these other phenomena that we can measure only imperfectly. We infer from them, we use them as proxies for material prosperity, and thence from material prosperity as a further proxy to human well-being. That's how I see it. And so what we would then, so we've got this sort of chain of abstraction, these layers of abstraction that separate what we can measure or what we can quantify, what we can actually evaluate, from what we truly care about. So there's quite a bit of separation there. And then so the question that I would ask with that is, okay, is GDP actually continuing to succeed in measuring material prosperity by evaluating what's produced, what's consumed, what's reported as income, and so forth? That's my first question. And if not, what would the erosion of that look like? What would we expect to see if that were devolving? And so that's sort of the first sub-question number one. And then the second sub-question, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so in that question, so the question was, is GDP any longer a good measurement of prosperity, which you just distinguished from something like well-being? So there's kind of like this problem of maybe what we actually care about is well-being, something we can measure is prosperity, and then there's even a third layer, which is GDP, which may fail to measure prosperity, and independently prosperity may fail to really measure well-being. Is that an accurate summary? Or?
That is, except that I don't think it's strictly speaking only the arrows only go from one level to the next. For example, I think we could be confounded. I think there's potential to be confounded that GDP could cease to reflect material prosperity, but could still continue to be a decent proxy for well-being, or even become a better proxy. So one could imagine sort of counterintuitive, sort of confounds like that, right? And so that's why I'm kind of interested in separating it out a little bit. We could, if this whole thing breaks down, we could just start completely fooling ourselves, or but it could be in quite unintuitive ways, right? So if well-being, after having satisfied material prosperity, is primarily determined by sort of the social and very much social and psychological services that you receive out of the economy. Say, for example, entertainment or something like that. I don't know. We could think about that in greater detail. One could imagine that even if GDP, ceases to really to reflect material, and I use material prosperity deliberately here. Even if GDP ceases to reflect material prosperity, it could if it continues to reflect other things traded in markets, maybe that could make it a better indicator of well-being. If we eliminate material prosperity as a constraint on the system. So I see it as a little bit more, potentially a little bit more subtle than just the links in a chain. I think there could be sort of a more of a causal web here. A simple one, obviously, but I'm not. I don't want to. Yeah, I don't want to like overcomplicate things unnecessarily. I just want to be cautious about making it a little bit too simple and linear. That's all.
Yeah, this came up last time, but maybe before getting into examples, and I actually have one in mind that I want to run past you. It does seem to me relevant, the role GDP. Well, there's GDP and there's also GDP growth, right? Which are both figures that get bandied around, and probably usually it's GDP growth that you talk about, right? So politicians, everybody has sort of seen some report where the GDP growth for China was estimated, or the US, and we talk about recessions, and it's often the growth number that's quoted. I think most people would probably have to look up on Google what the GDP of America or Australia was, right? As a number, because that's much less common. It's very uncommon that you'd hear someone say the GDP of Australia is 1.6 trillion US dollars or something. That's not a number that people mention. Its rate of change, yeah, it's an exponential, so it's the percentage change over the previous year. So GDP growth would be listed as 4%. If there's a 4% growth in the GDP from year end to year end plus one. Yeah. And the presumption there, I mean, that's why if you maintain a GDP growth of 2%, like the rate is constant, but that means exponential increase in GDP, which roughly speaking we have seen in many places over the last few hundred years. But yeah, I do think it is a difference, right? Because okay, maybe I'll just give the example. I can't think of very clear examples that are directly linked to technological disruption, although maybe this one is in some way. Well, okay, it clearly is. So fertility and the fertility crisis in many places seems to me like one of the key examples of the failure of GDP as a measure of future well-being. Maybe it's more about the longer run trajectory, but to use the example of China, as I've done in the past, so China's had very high GDP growth over the last few decades, and I've been lucky enough to be in China several times to see firsthand what that feels like for people. But now they're in a situation where, due to that, a lot of policies that incentivized GDP growth directly. Both parents often work. They often have very competitive careers. People feel they have to work very hard to maintain a middle-class lifestyle and to ensure one for their child. Childcare costs are high. The medical insurance system is weak. People have to support their parents. All of that means that people work very hard and are quite stressed and feel, even to a greater extent than maybe people in Australia or rich Western countries do, that one child is about all they can manage. And so the government is desperate, like absolutely desperate, to get people to have more kids. But basically there's this very widespread phenomenon where the government basically wants to go to each individual woman and say, okay, make a trade-off which says less career and more kids for the sake of the country. And a lot of women are just saying, no thanks, I'm not going to be, basically signing up to be, well, okay, there's social issues we don't need to get into, but now from a long run point of view, right, the well-being of people over many decades, it would be completely rational to spend much higher percentages of GDP to encourage population growth, right, to put in place policies and so on that would allow people to make these choices, not be coerced into them. And Japan is starting to do that. It's a kind of weak source still, but and China's like madly rushing headlong into that kind of policy direction. But this strikes me as an example of, okay, why would GDP fail to capture the relevant trends here? Well, it's because a lot of the value produced by women when they're, by either gender when they're raising children, but often it's in the modern world women who are putting in most of the time, so I'll just say women. The child rearing time is not like directly valued somehow. It's not coming into any of those three categories, except insofar as you buy diapers and milk formula and so on. But that number doesn't really show up in the GDP, so it's not directly optimized when you just focus on the GDP. And in the end, that it's a kind of like the long-run optimization of GDP, you'd actually invest in human capital to an extraordinary degree, and in particular in supporting women to make the choice to have more children or families. So that's, the fertility issue seems to me like an example of where this has failed. You could say that's technological disruption because it was, of course, the contraceptive pill that allowed this situation to exist. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that example.
Yeah, it's a great example. I will run that by my I'll run it by my colleague Brad as well. He's just getting ready to publish a short piece on our blog website that mentions the birth control pill and some of the history of disruption that led to it. The birth control pill, and more specifically, the development of the technology to synthesize hormones in general, is related to, just by a quirk of history, the disruption of the fountain pen by ballpoint pens. And that
what's the connection there?
Technological disruption. It's only a quirk of history. It's not a direct causal connection. It's just that the individual person, the entrepreneur who developed the ballpoint pen technology in the 1930s, and made his fortune that way, then went on to spend that fortune developing synthetic hormone production technology. And so he was instrumental sort of in two major, not major, but in two different quite different technology disruptions. You could argue that the ballpoint pen was a bigger disruption than you might imagine. It's not that other writing implements weren't available, but it did change the nature of writing. Anyway, it should be a fun, easy series of blog posts to read, and I think Brad's planning on publishing them starting next week. So I'll keep an eye out for those. And the birth control pill is certainly one of the most profound technological changes in human history. There's no question about that. No matter how profound people say that it is, it's almost impossible to overstate how big of a deal it was. It's certainly. I think you're this example of the failure of GDP to capture something that's very very relevant to not just well-being, but also productivity itself and the long-term maximization of productivity. And certainly, if you were thinking retrospectively, you could come up with some future scenarios where we don't really need a bigger population to maximize productivity because we're going to have automation, yada yada yada. But if you were to either exclude that from consideration or perhaps imagine this conversation happening 30, 40, 50 years ago, in the context of the contraceptive pill. Yeah, you could absolutely see how, failure to measure the productive contribution of child rearing in any long-term, optimization decision making that evaluates production at all. Yeah, that's a major, this is a major shortcoming, obviously. That's interesting, very interesting point, Dan.
I'm just going to attach a speaker because otherwise the yellow arrows that lead people up here aren't visible. Yeah, thanks, Chad, for going to find Martin. Yeah, that's right. I mean, of course, there's a kind of meta discussion, which is maybe we don't think GDP is actually measuring the things that we want to measure, and that's fine. But I think what we're saying now is even on its own terms, the failure to measure the sort of productive contribution of child rearing and even education as a kind of growth factor in and of itself is a failure which leads to policy which shoots yourself in the foot.
Yeah.
Okay, so given that example, go ahead.
I was going to say the original motivation for asking this question, do we see hints already, was about the technology that sort of decouples. Well, that's not the right way to say it. Partly it is. So the another example to think about would be the ephemeralization or the dematerialization of what were once physical goods into digital goods. So what were once physical information goods, like copies of newspapers and physical recordings of music and video, film and video and so forth, having the digital revolution. My team has not published on this, so I don't have a sort of a firm, formal vocabulary that I'm committed to using. So I'm going to be kind of sloppy and loose with it. But there's the combination of computers and networking technology and other information technologies. Sensors, the CCD sensors for digital imaging, and all sorts of software and everything from compression codecs to all kinds of a whole suite of technologies that are associated with computers, computing, telecommunications, networking, that culminated in the wide availability of computation and the broader phenomenon of the internet. We put all of those things together. We have a very large number, I think, of examples of products. Not just services, but products, physical products that were once sold in retail outlets to end users, and of course were others that were sold sort of between businesses, so business to business transactions, products. Those have effectively disappeared from the three pieces of GDP that, for example, the Australian did you say it was the central bank? Is that right? I mean, so I think the example I used before were the pictures that you take with your phone. It's because you no longer have to develop them. You no longer have to pay for them as individual products. That has disappeared. Whatever that was worth, it's gone from GDP. And this is somewhat ironic or paradoxical, depending on how you want to look at it, because we are producing so many more pictures than we ever did. I think we are guessing somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times more images than we ever did, even at the very peak with film cameras. And so that's just one example. So then the question would be: can that continue in any kind of can that trend continue in any sort of steady sense, will other things be sort of digitalized or dematerialized in that same way? One could imagine an endpoint where you sort of have a Star Trek replicator 3D printing sort of technology where any material object could be printed out in the same, in any quantity with a negligible marginal cost. And in the same way that, you can copy and produce and do whatever with digital files.
Can you explain why you're so... Sorry.
So I was all I was wondering, I guess, is from those examples, can we imagine any further? So I guess if that's happened, has that eroded GDP in any meaningful way already by removing some number of products from what GDP measures, even though we as a society, as a civilization, are still getting the benefit of that prosperity of that production. And then what do these sort of intervening steps from here looking forward to some conceivable future where all the rest of the remaining physical trade is eliminated, and none of that is left, and maybe there are remaining, say for example, service markets for services, but markets for physical products are largely gone or almost entirely gone, except for a few tiny niches that are left or something like that. And so what would that, do we see any hints that we're doing this already, and what would that look like? Yeah, that's that's my overarching curiosity here.
Yeah, I wonder if I don't agree with the premise. I don't think physical versus digital, is that really the relevant distinction? I mean, let's talk through the example of CD sales in music and the modern music economy is, well, how did people make money from music in 2000 or, 1990? Well, it was through CD sales, licensing for movies and TV shows, and gigs, I guess, mostly, right? And maybe it was always the case that licensing for TV shows and movies was, I don't know the relative proportions, but that's a lot bigger than people think. So Lucas, that's his territory, right? And there is a lot of money in the kind of background music that you hear in Survivor or whatever TV show you want to watch that varies its music from episode to episode. That's an enormous market, not to be underestimated. But okay, so those are the kind of ways that people made money from music before Napster. Now, there was a period there where the digital form was just a pure loss and like just completely invisible economically, right? I mean, you had to pay for internet access, but Napster really wasn't, I don't think anything to do with Napster would show up in economic figures. You could make the argument that people downloaded a lot of musicians' music that they wouldn't have listened to otherwise and then became fans and went out and bought their CDs, but overall I think it was just a net drain on measurable economic activity. Then you had the Apple's the music store, and that was a kind of model for a while, and now it seems like most of the economic activity is in terms of paid listening to music is subscription based. But you could say that's a disruption, but I'm pretty sure that the figures for the revenue from streaming are significantly lower now, even though the market is probably much bigger than CD sales were back before all this started. So it's in some sense just a story of decline. Okay, now in that case, it's not, is it really the fact, I mean, is it really physical versus digital, or is it, I mean, the fact that we're now in a model where it's not the marginal cost of music is zero, but it's a different economic model, right? It's streaming, or if you're paying for individual songs, which I still do, you're still paying for a copy of the song.
Yeah, I suppose it's much less. It's not. I mean, and in my teams work, we're quite careful to never say zero marginal cost. We just say near zero or extremely low. But it's literally zero is rare. You have to have sort of unusual market conditions, and in particular, kind of quirky or perverse things going on the supply side. I think I mentioned negative pricing for electricity under certain circumstances. You do get things like that, but that doesn't mean that the true cost is in sort of any physical terms is zero. It's just very, very low. And I think the way that I think about it is that at some point the unit cost, and marginal cost is part of that, but there are other things that go into the cost of a unit of something. But say, for example, the unit of music, or we could do a unit of imaging. At some point, the cost becomes so low, very, very, very low, that it doesn't pay to engage in traditional per unit market transactions. So markets that trade those individual units. And instead, we've seen new markets with different business models emerge, like streaming, where you don't pay for. I mean, and people have disagreed with this whole premise, this whole idea, this whole phenomenon. They're big proponents of microtransactions, where the increments of currency that you're using to purchase are just tiny. I mean, still would support a proper per unit market trades. But instead, most business models that we've seen that have had the price fall vanishingly low per unit of whatever, they switch to a subscription. You pay a service charge, you pay an access charge. You just pay your ISP, and that gets you on the internet. You just pay your streaming service, and that gets you all. It gives you an all-you-can-eat buffet kind of thing. In fact, I hadn't even thought of the all-you-can buffet, but maybe that's to think about that. But that's basically what, in my mind, it was the distinction, is that when things become extremely inexpensive because of improvements in technology, they seem to be they seem to show up differently in GDP. Mm-hmm. And what you would expect is not what we see. So if a technology allows you to produce thousands of times more of something, like thousands of times more images, then you might expect, well, GDP would be thousands of times higher, at least that portion of it, and then material prosperity would be thousands of times higher in that particular way, and then that would have this massive impact on well-being. And I don't think we see any of that, right? I think one could argue that the material prosperity gains are there, but they are both not necessarily reflected in the GDP as a metric. And then perhaps on the other side, maybe all that material prosperity doesn't translate very well into human well-being. And then you've got a whole other camp of folks who are focused on that issue, that particular problem. That stuff doesn't make us happier beyond a certain point, which is I think a well-supported claim psychologically. But I'm not so much interested in that. I'm familiar with some of those lines of reasoning, but that my thing that I'm most interested in is this paradox of increasing material prosperity that doesn't it doesn't seem to be captured very well in GDP, and that doesn't seem to be appreciated very well.
How do you think about the example of artificial light? So that seems like one of the clearest cases of this kind of phenomenon, right? Where
that's a good one. That's a really good one.
The people I don't know what percentage of GDP was buying candles, but it must have been pretty enormous.
It was. Yeah.
And then that went to near zero, I guess. Now that you could say that freed up many hours per day for people to relax, but also to work. It lengthened the work day, and and made possible working in factories that would have been kind of intolerable without artificial light. So there's a kind of a direct way in which it increased economic output in other places, which compensated for the loss in economic output that would have been measured by simply buying, selling, and manufacturing candles or oil or whatever, gas, lanterns. Maybe I'm thinking electrification, but I suppose it happened in two stages, didn't it? There was gas lighting and then electrification.
Right.
So, but lumping those together, perhaps. So these disruptions enable all sorts of other economic activity. But it's maybe there's a significant lag, right? Where there's a kind of phase transition, maybe, where the kind of world that exists with very expensive artificial light just is different to the world that exists with very cheap artificial light. And the configuration of everything shifts, and there's a period, I mean, this is typical of phase transitions, where when you're actually going through the phase transition, key indicators may just remain constant, even though a lot is happening, because the system's kind of being reconfigured, right? So I think that's probably just as much true of economies as it is of physical systems, where you could imagine GDP kind of tracks, it's kind of like a temperature measure, maybe, right? Where, there's kind of like the temperature is going up, there's more activity, but then you could see a phase where just the configuration of the economy is changing, and it doesn't seem like the temperature goes up. Like the GDP may not change, but behind the scenes, you're maintaining a given GDP level while completely changing the system that produces it. And when you come out the other side, that new system is just capable of operating at maybe an order of magnitude higher level, and then you can continue to grow again. So maybe that's the kind of thing we're looking at, where it's not like maybe we think GDP will fail long term to be a useful measure, because GDP continued to be useful, or was maybe only started to be tracked diligently after the transition to artificial light. But you could imagine that if you had the economic data beforehand, people would have been using it, would have been caring about it, and they did afterwards. But you can easily imagine that during some of these transitions it wouldn't be so useful, exactly because what you instead, the measure of progress is really something like a shift in the operating system.
Well, it's funny, Dan, you're using exact language and metaphors, phase change in particular, that my two colleagues, Tony and Jamie, that they use literally verbatim. That's a big portion of their model that's in their book. The book that they wrote, Rethinking Humanity, which is very much theorizes that same sort of right along the same lines. There are things about that are I mean, anyway, they have an interesting theoretical framework, and it makes use of a number of the same ideas and metaphors or analogies, whatever's a better term, that you just invoked. So yeah, their thinking is right along those lines, and I think there is a lot to be said for that. And a couple of two things in particular jump out to me. One thing definitely. So let me just build on that real quickly, and circle back to an earlier idea from a previous session that we had as well. So you mentioned that we've got this sort of the potential, at least, for what could be going on is a change in the structure of production itself, such that the expansion, the growth of construction can continue, of production rather, not construction, of production can continue. So GDP grows up to a certain point, and then you have this metaphor of a phase change. There's a reconfiguration, and this is part of what enables the GDP growth to continue. And one could say economic growth as well. I think we might run into some problems there. I'll get to there in just a second. I'll connect to that idea in just a second. But for right now, this sounds very much like the sort of the it sounds very similar to me to what I've heard folks like Ray Kurzweil describe, which is just about technology in general, which is that, one particular technological change or regime that does follow an S curve enables subsequent ones. And so the overarching, or I should say, the overlapping instances of individual S curve phenomena, when you sort of sum a whole bunch of S curves and they keep coming and keep coming, the overarching result is just an exponential that keeps going. And so this is very much kind of it reminds me very much of that kind of thinking, right? Okay, so let me loop back around and connect to this idea from a couple of weeks ago, which is that GDP as a measure is an indication of that which is scarce and that which is traded, and those are connected perhaps in that which is scarce enough to be traded, and things that are abundant are not traded because they're we simply don't do that. Economies as we understand them are about the allocation of scarce resources, the exchange and the trading to optimize the distribution of things between different agents with different sets of priorities and goals and values and so forth. But when you reduce all that, you get to something like there's scarcity and trade accordingly, and GDP is some sort of reflection of that scarcity and the trade around it. And so I guess this is, and that's how I originally sort of stumbled blindly and backwards into this whole mess that we're talking about here, which is, well, if we're becoming more and more abundant, or if productivity is growing and things in general becoming more abundant, then what is GDP? What is it left? What does it have left to do? What remains?
But that's a pretty
scarce is what remains.
That's a pretty product and commodity focused statement, though, right? I mean, it's already true that a majority of the GDP in the US and Australia is made up of services, and would you say exactly that? Like, it's not like scissors that hairdressers use are scarce. The value from a hairdresser is not because they have a scarce resource that you're buying access to, right? It's the service, and I suppose you could say that's scarce, and it is, because there's not infinitely many people who can cut your hair, although there it's probably the true scarcity is more like real estate rather than people. So the scarcity, I'm glad to hear that, Martin. The scarcity is, we have a lot of rising prices in particularly dense urban areas that are to do more with people's desire to congregate than to any scarce resource particularly. You could say it's real estate, but there's also, like, even if real estate were relatively abundant, I guess the true scarce resource there is just real estate, but it's also like job opportunities and network effects that are in some sense non-physical already. So let me put forward a kind of counterpoint, which is that suppose everything becomes digital. I mean, here we are, right? We are talking in a virtual world.
Talking about real estate and congregating.
Do you imagine that, like, the scarcity of positions in Harvard or like access to the best teachers would just disappear the moment you make it digital? I doubt it. In fact, it would become worse, I would predict. I mean, suppose that every university is online and doing this. Then, well, the best teachers in the world will be competed for by every single student on Earth. Do you think that it's not the difference? I mean, the true scarce resources are going to be, and have always been to some extent, talent and context and networks and positions in networks. That's the reason why the cost of higher education in the US just keeps going up and up, while a lot of other resources become relatively cheap and abundant. And that's not a physical world phenomenon, I don't think. It's not because Harvard doesn't have enough space on their campus. That's not the constraint there. So I'm not sure that I think I would predict that economic value shifts to an extraordinary degree over the next few decades to that kind of scarcity. And that is not easy to see that goes away because it's always a matter of relative position, right? Even if the economy, even if we have, suppose we get AGI and we've got exponentially increasing economic growth, like even the growth rate is increasing exponentially, so it's 5%, then 10%, then 20%. Well, there'll still be a frontier, and there'll still be a center, and there'll still be places where it's much more valuable to be than other places, and the entry points to those places will be the most valuable resources on Earth. So I don't think it's accurate to sort of see like it's just a general abundance as removing almost everything from the economy. I think these phenomena will persist.
I find that very persuasive. And if it were true, I hope it is. That would be great. It would be nice and clean and elegant if it were true. But if what you were saying is true, and GDP will simply continue to work, and it will simply shift from measuring physical stuff that's produced that was scarce in the past to services that continue to be scarce, and it doesn't really matter. I mean, the physical basis, the substrate just gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper until it just sort of disappears into the background. That's great. The conclusion there is, well, there probably will be some sort of natural continuity to GDP and its usefulness. And in some ways, we kind of see this already. I mean, in fact, I hope the answer. I hope that the answer to the whole question here is as simple as that. It would be beautiful if it was. And now, if I cast my eyes back and ask, well, what could it be that simple? And then we'll say, well, let's test that. And if your hypothesis in the 1980s were that would be the case, and you're in 1980s, and there hasn't been this massive digitalization yet, and your argument is, well, there are going to be these huge disruptions of what are today physical products, and and they're going to be replaced by services, but there's going to be an emergence of a service-based economy and things that you can't even imagine are services or will become ones, like YouTube influencer or whatever else that people will pay for, and you're not going to believe it, but GDP will just keep cranking along, and it won't even get knocked around or shocked all that much. It'll just nicely and smoothly navigate over the bumps of this massive structural change to civilization and economies, and you're not going to believe what the internet is going to do to the world. But GDP is just going to cruise smooth as silk right over that, with not any more than the regular variation. And if you had told me that in 1980, I would have thought that was an unlikely. I would have thought, man, well, that seems isn't that a little bit too convenient? But adaptive, it's just a phenomena that sort of seek attractor basins and points of homeostasis. They kind of have a way of doing that, and maybe this is an example of that, where despite these sort of underlying structural changes that could be profound, we will simply just continue measuring things with this tool, and it will seem quite smooth and not rocky and crazy and bouncing all around, and we'll just progressively less and less be interested in physical stuff, and more be interested in that which does remain scarce, and which will increasingly, I suppose, be an unimaginably broad plethora of services and that sort of stuff, that sort of thing. And then allowing for, like you said, a handful of things that are physical that remain fundamentally scarce, like real estate.
Yeah, it does matter though whether these services are whether access to these high points of strategic utility, which I think describes an undergraduate position at Harvard pretty well, whether access to those is exchanged at some point for more easily measurable quantities, right? So as it stands, okay, so you're a parent and you work your whole life selling pancakes, and then your bank account full of pancake money is then emptied in order to secure 30 minutes of education at Harvard. Well, that showed up in the GDP figures with the pancakes, right? Even if Harvard itself is not. But that could change, right? And actually, I'd be interested to study like an economic history of our more aristocratic era where there would have been a lot of economic value, so to speak, exchanged simply by relative status among the aristocracy and access to rents, right? Where you could imagine, giving out a position like Earl of Sussex or something is, an access to certain economic rents, but that's traded for something, but that something is invisible economically, right?
Yeah.
So maybe there's earlier periods of history where GDP would have been much less useful because it's not that there are lots of transactions and activity that just simply never cash out in expenditure, income, or production.
Yeah,
So,
we mentioned this, I think, last week or the week before too. That we mentioned the idea of informal economies, black markets, gray markets that are not visible to these measures either. And what we didn't do is sort of discuss their relative proportion, like how large are they relative to the formal economy, and how has that changed over the course of history. I think that's part of what you're getting at here, and then how might that continue to change in the future.
because you
Yeah,
can
good
easily
question.
imagine that a future economy looks more feudal, and I would say that's my modal prediction, really, where you've got some kind of sovereigns that have access to very advanced AI, and we could name some of the candidates right now. And then your access to economic opportunities is sort of proportional to the degree to which they deign to sort of reflect some of their light onto you, right? And you can see some of that already in the way that some of these fortunes that are, say, made from cryptocurrency are used to support various ventures. There's kind of a patronage economy in science that's re-emerging along those kinds of lines, in which I think will become more prominent over time. So you can imagine that within that, I mean, if that's the way we're going, then a lot of that activity will, you could call it grey market, I suppose, but it'll be sort of internal to this, kind of quasi-feudal arrangement. And maybe that's a reason to think the opposite, that GDP will in fact not become a useful measure. We've reached the end of our time, but do you have any final comments you want to make? We can continue next week, obviously, with question 3 or the remaining topics in question 2.
Yeah, this is great. I think I'll leave it. I have some thoughts. I'll try not to forget. But I am interested in returning to this idea of, what, and it's maybe broadens to a larger discussion about what does a future with technologically enabled material abundance look like, and we can't go that far out. I think we need to maintain some discipline. I think it. I appreciate the metaphor of the singularity. I fundamentally do. The way that manifests in my own thinking most firmly is that I do not do any formal analysis or scenarios out past a certain timeline, because I think they're kind of reckless and irresponsible.
You mean like
There's a very
2028?
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, is it's frightening how much closer that's gotten, and I'm having to rethink things a little bit here as a result of that. But so I don't want to necessarily take us down too far of the conjecture rabbit hole if we're past that horizon. But I think there are some fun things to talk about. What could the intervening stages be? And that's sort of the thing that I'm most interested about this specific question about GDP. Like, what could we see this happening, and what might happen in the what might that look like in the near term, as we sort of are moving from one, or we're sort of progressing through some phase shift, and the same for just more broadly, as the world is changing and shifting in a way that abundance of the material sort is becomes more available. What along the way does that look like? We can't perhaps know what things look like 30 years from now, but we can try to imagine some of the pitfalls between here and there, and maybe have produce some valuable insight about how to avoid making mistakes, or what things to be on guard against, and how to maximize some of the benefits that are likely to accrue along the way, and so forth. And so I'd like to pick up that conversation next time if we can. I think that would be great.
Sounds great. Yeah, thanks everyone for coming along. Thanks again, Adam, and look forward to continuing next week.
Great. Thanks, everybody.